Hi, I'm Tom Panas, and we're here today for a visit to Sunsetview Cemetery in El Cerrito in Kensington. Right behind us is the beautiful mid-century modern building designed by William Cortlandt. It went up in 1962. It replaced a beautiful old stone-faced building which had stood over here but had long outlived its usefulness. That building had in turn replaced the original wooden structure, which could best be described as humble. There's been a crematory on the property here since 1926, but no funeral home on the property originally. But eventually in the 50s, the cemetery bought the property across the street here just by the church. The cemetery originally hoped that they could use that to build a structure which actually didn't get built, but this structure was built instead. That cemetery was not just a cemetery building. It was going to be a building that could be used for weddings, graduations, any kinds of funeral receptions, anything like that. But the plans just fell through on that. Cemetery still owns the property, and over the years they've wanted to put parking in there. But given that most of the cemetery is in El Cerrito and is in Kensington, including the structures, El Cerrito has a rule that you can't have parking if you don't have a building. So that land just sits idle, which the local community really enjoys, but someday I'm sure that someone will make an offer that interests the cemetery and that property will be sold. El Cerrito has interesting borders. Most people notice that if they look at a map. And El Cerrito's borders are a direct result of Mexican land grants. The original settlers from the Anza Expedition came here, and they mostly settled in the San Jose and San Francisco area. But across the bay in Contra, Costa County, there was farming and other kinds of agricultural enterprises going on, run by the Spanish. And one of the men who came with the Anza Expedition was actually one of the first people to run the agricultural operation on this side of the bay. When he died, he had been the grantee of a very large tract of land. It ran from Cerrito Creek all the way up to Point Pinole. And when he died, he left it to his wife and each of his 11 kids. And those 11 kids and wife, they all started immediately selling pieces of land and not telling anyone else. This caused enormous problems, and there was a very famous land case which eventually settled the whole mess in 1893. And almost all the straight lines we see on the maps now are the result of a judge's decision about who owned what. There were roughly 3 times as many claims for acreage in West Contra Costa as there actually was acreage. So a lot of arbitrary lines were drawn. And the line, for example, Sunset Cemetery is literally defined by the creek on one side and the lines of different land grant holders on the other side. Hi, I said we were in the Palm section of the cemetery, and the Palm section includes a beautiful little hill, and we're at the top of that hill. And what's at the top of that hill but this amazing monument to the Dean Witter family. Dean Witter ran a very prominent financial firm. It was well known in the San Francisco Bay Area and a number of other metropolitan areas across the country, and all of his various family members who chose to be buried here are immortalized here. Some born as far back as the 1850s and 60s. From up here you can see a lot of the cemetery, but one interesting thing should you come up here is if you look out to the north, you see a couple of roads, but then there's one last section of lawn with graves in it that butts up against some houses. That section of the cemetery, that last section, is actually in El Cerrito. And in fact, that's because one of those land grant lines we just talked about basically runs up that road. The Cemetery Association owns 59 acres, of which 52 are in Kensington and 7 are in El Cerrito. It's an El Cerrito and Kensington cemetery, but it's also known as Berkeley Cemetery. Cemeteries aren't allowed in Berkeley, so a lot of people from Berkeley are buried here. The cemetery property and the funeral home are owned by the Cemetery Association. There's actually 3 trusts underneath the Cemetery Association: the Mortuary Trust, the Cemetery Trust, and the Endowment Trust. Current projections indicate that Sunsetview will be completely full in 30 to 40 years. As of the end of 2021, there's about 67,000 people who are interned here. The endowment's currently worth about $30 million. and by all standards that appears to be sufficient to provide perpetual care for the cemetery once no one is being buried here. The cemetery also owns land at the foot of Fairmont Avenue. Fairmont Avenue used to end at San Pablo Avenue, and the cemetery owned several different plots of land down there on which they had wells and pumped water up here to irrigate the cemetery. Eventually that land was sold, part of it to the city, so that Fairmont Avenue could be extended from San Pablo Avenue to Carlson Boulevard. And over the years, there's been numerous breaks in that pipe that had to be fixed. Neither Caltrans, nor East Bay Mud, nor the city, nor PG&E, or anyone else really has a clear idea of where that pipe actually runs. And so the cemetery staff is always trying to keep an eye open for any kind of potential construction going on down there so they can let the team know that there's a pipe buried somewhere down there. As I said, it's broken now. It's been broken for a few years, and the issue is it's not going to be a huge job to fix it, but the fact that it's a small job and the people who would have to fix it need to be qualified by the state to work underneath a state highway or on the right-of-way of a state highway makes it a very unappealing job for any firms that are of the size that could do that work. So the cemetery currently is just running on East Bay mud water. We're just about 20 feet away from the Dean Witter site, but we're at a very interesting gravestone. This gravestone has an engraving over here, GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, 1861 to 1865. The person buried here is a Civil War veteran. There are several of those in the cemetery. We'll be taking a look at another one later on, but we don't know of anyone from El Cerrito who fought in the Civil War, but some people did come here after the Civil War and ended up being buried here. There's also a Mason's symbol here, so this person was a Mason. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were so many fraternal societies. Right over here is a person who was a member of the Women of Woodcraft, buried in 1913. There were all these fraternal societies, the Foresters, the Redmond, the Order of the Eastern Star. They're all over the cemetery. You see their symbols, and it really talks about a different time than what we live in now, where there were all these societies that people were members of. We're here at a gravestone that reads Rose Griffin and Warren Griffin. And we're actually here for a third person whose name isn't listed there, Evan Griffin. Evan Griffin was a kid born in 1863, and he lived a great kid's life out in the country. He lived out west of here. He had to, get a regular job and be working at some time between the time he was 14 and 16. He hated school, but he obviously was a man about town. He knew everybody. He knew the Tewksburys, he knew the Niestroms, he knew the Rumrells, he knew the Emmerichs, he knew the Alvarados, he knew the Barretts, he knew the Nichols. And I thank the Lord that one day I happened across a little pamphlet in the El Cerrito Library called An Early History of Richmond. And it was something that Evan Griffin had written in 1938 because his sister, who happened to be the head librarian of the Richmond Library, knew he had a great memory and asked him to write something down. And it is the most densely packed description of life in this area that you could ever imagine. And it was so popular that his sister asked him to add to it. So in 1939, he wrote another 8 or 12 pages. And anybody who wants to know about almost anything that happened in our area in the early days needs to read those. Fortunately, I was able to locate the family and got permission to scan those documents and put them on the El Cerrito Historical Society website. But it's just the most amazing description of life and people, and Evan's, boy, his opinion of people, it's just amazing and fun to read. So we've stopped here at the grave of several members of the Oishi family, and it's very interesting because there's interesting racial history in El Cerrito, and in the cemetery there is essentially an Asian section where for many years, if you were Asian, you had to be buried there. Not that it was a horrible place, but you couldn't pick your own spot. I suspect this grave is here because it came from a time when the laws about where you could be buried in El Cerrito Cemetery or Kensington Cemetery weren't firmly followed as they were, but there were a lot of anti-Asian laws passed in the first part of the 1900s, and eventually people of Asian descent stopped being buried in this part of the cemetery. You had to be in the Asian section. El Cerrito has such an interesting history with Asians. Most people are not aware, because it was so long ago, there was an enormous Japanese wholesale nursery community out on the northwest corner of El Cerrito, the adjoining area of Richmond, and also expanded out on Brookside. And they were there and owning property long before there were anti-Asian movements around. Even with the Chinese, if you were Chinese in the late 1800s and the first part of the 1900s, you could live anywhere you wanted as long as it was in downtown Oakland or downtown San Francisco. There was actually a home for Chinese boys. It was run by the Baptist Church, and it was for boys whose families weren't orphans, but the families weren't able to take care of them. And to have that opened in 1937, and to have that open in El Cerrito was really unusual. We have just a really interesting history with Asians in El Cerrito. They've contributed in a very big way to our community, and we don't always realize that, and a lot of those traces are gone now. We're here at the graves of Cordelia and Ben Rawson. Ben, GAR, Grand Army of the Republic. He was a Civil War veteran. Cordelia, WRC, Women's Relief Corps. They were obviously both very strong patriots. Ben fought in the war. Cordelia supported the war effort. And in fact, when Ben came home from the war, he erected a separate monument here to the California Battalion. He was so dedicated to the country of the United States and to his compatriots in the California Battalion, he actually erected a monument to them to commemorate their work in the Civil War. We're here in the little part of the cemetery that I call Royal Row. I call it Royal Row because of the significance of the people who are memorialized here. There are people like the Nystroms, who were fundamental in the development of Richmond. You've got the Sprouls and the Wheelers, who were very important in the development of the University of California. You've got the Blakes and some others who were they were all about the development of Kensington and the upper part of El Cerrito. I've come to appreciate this as Royal Row since this monument was pointed out to me. It's one that I actually hadn't noticed or recognized the importance of. It reads, "In loving memory of Helen Crandall, a volunteer nurse who died in Berkeley, California at her post during the influenza epidemic of 1918. And here in 2023, with us having just gone through a COVID disaster, the importance of people like this becomes so clear to us as much as anybody else who is buried in this cemetery. We're here in front of the primary water feature at the cemetery, and there's always been a water feature at the cemetery. I can't say always, but I've certainly seen very early pictures of the cemetery where there was a beautiful waterfall, not necessarily this one, which was built in the 40s or 50s. Those of you who were in California in the 50s and 60s, you may remember the newsletter called PG&E Progress, which came out every month with your bill, and the water features here at Sunset were featured several times. If you think about any business, what are the three most important things a business needs to do right? Marketing, marketing, marketing. And so the cemetery has always worked to make sure that people know that it's here and ready to help them when they have a need. They ran ads all over Northern California. There were ads in newspaper flyers. There were ads everywhere, and they got every chance they could. They tried to get publicity. So we're not just here because of the water. Just off to the left is the grave of James McVitie. Mr. McVitie was the city manager of Richmond in the 1930s and 1940s. And Richmond was an extraordinarily busy place and important to the effort during World War II. In Richmond, they built 747 Victory ships and Liberty ships that supported troops both in Europe and in Asia. Those were mostly built from 1943 till 1945. When you look at how the area changed to support that, The population of Richmond went from under 25,000 in 1941 to over 100,000 in 1945. Try and imagine running a city where the growth looked like that. Even providing the most fundamental services was next to impossible, not to mention wartime restrictions on almost everything you might need. El Cerrito saw a similar increase in population, but Mr. McVitie wrote the most amazing document about that situation. An avalanche hits Richmond, and in that document, it's a rich historical document and describes all the stuff that happened and was needed by Richmond. Hard to find, except we were able to get a copy of it, and it's on the Historical Society website. I really recommend that for someone who's interested in how that kind of unbelievable growth might impact a city. We're here at a section of the cemetery called Baby Land, and there's a lot of infants and young kids who were buried here. Right here is the grave of Chio Maeda, died very young after not quite 2 years. She came from a family that was one of our many Japanese nursery wholesale families, and her family had a lot of heartbreak. There was her, and several years later her father was killed in a boiler explosion at their nursery. Most of the Japanese nurseries ran kind of year-round. They had hothouses, and in the winter and sometimes in the summer they'd grow inside the hothouse, and in the summer they would grow outside the hothouse. The primary products the local nurserymen produced were roses and carnations. Very high quality products. At one point their products were considered the definition of quality in the rose industry. But when you ran your hothouse at winter, you had to have a boiler that you ran to keep the hothouses hot so the plants would grow. And occasionally there would be a boiler explosion. Boiler explosions are just horrible events, and her father was killed in a boiler explosion. Hi, we're at the gravesite here of Hikojiro and Tomi Mabuchi and their youngest daughter, Clara. They were part of the community of Japanese nursery people, but they had probably the smallest operation of all the different nurseries. But they became very special 10 or 15 years ago to those of us interested in history, because their building was the only building that remained from the enormous Japanese nursery industry presence in El Cerrito and Richmond. All the others had been torn down. The city of El Cerrito was interested in building a housing development on part of the property where their house stood. A house and shop stood, and we were actually able to, many hours of negotiations and unhappy discussions, but we were able to get the city to willingly agree, to preserve their building as a memory of the Japanese-American nursery presence in El Cerrito. And not only that, we got out of it an incredibly wonderful historical plaza and set of descriptive plaques and pavers that are at that institution now, and that permanently enshrine the history of our Japanese nursery community into the fabric of El Cerrito. I'm here at the grave now of Jun Honda and his wife May and son. Jun and his wife welcomed me with open arms when I came looking for Japanese history in El Cerrito. I went looking for Japanese history only because so many of the old Italians and Portuguese guys who I was interviewing at the time kept saying, "Have you found out anything about all those Japanese nurseries that used to be out northwest part of town?" And it was like Jun had been waiting for someone to come talk to him and ask him questions. The Japanese community had gone through so much by the time I came across Jun in the early 2000s. They initially established themselves as a presence in the nursery industry in the Bay Area in the 1890s. Mr. Dumoto and several brothers came here thinking that they were going to get rich, and instead ended up first as gardeners. But then they started wholesale nurseries down in Oakland, and They created an entire nursery industry in the Bay Area, in many cases using relatives from Japan. Every year they would call for more relatives to come, and they built a nursery industry that was headquartered in San Francisco at a market they founded, the California Flower Market. And Half Moon Bay, Redwood City, San Leandro, Hayward, Oakland, El Cerrito, Richmond, and several other places were all sites where there was a lot of Japanese nurseries. The California Flower Market was really an act of genius because it allowed the flower growers to all come together and sell to the broader market without necessarily having to compete against each other. They all specialized in something, and they could sell it at the California Flower Mart. They built this amazing, amazing industry, and then the 1930s came along, and the state built the Bay Bridge. The East Shore Freeway was built as far as Potrero Avenue in El Cerrito, and the state took about half the property that Jun and his cousin held for growing flowers in El Cerrito. Well, they dealt with that, but then World War II came along, and all these Japanese, many of whom were American citizens, were sent off to internment camps, and their property was basically not taken from them, but they had no access to their property. Contra Costa County, actually Richmond specifically, was truly unique because all except one of the roughly 20 Japanese nurseries in West County had their loans with Mechanics Bank. And Mr. Downer at Mechanics Bank forgave all the interest and principal payments that were due whenever a family couldn't make the payment. So different than almost everywhere else in California, when the Japanese came back, they still owned their property because Mr. Downer and Mechanics Bank had forgiven them payments they couldn't make. That doesn't mean that vengeful citizens hadn't gone through and destroyed their greenhouse, trashed their houses, etc., but at least they had a place to start over. So many of the Japanese community members who I met before they passed would tell me, we would have given up, but our parents, they just pressed on. We rebuilt better than we had before. Jun's parents, Hikujiro and Masui, are buried right up the hill here. There's so many families up here. The Sakais and the Oishis were early joiners to the business of the wholesale nurseries. Sam Sakai ran the California Flower Market while he was in internment camp in Arkansas or Alabama. He ran it by mail. When Japanese young men were given the opportunity to join the U.S. Army during World War II, Jun joined the famous 442nd Combat Regiment. That regiment was the most decorated, i.e., got the most injuries per person of any regiment in the history of the U.S. Army. The commanding general had nothing but praise for the Japanese soldiers. He said, send me as many of these as you can. They participated and were instrumental in so many campaigns in Europe. It would have been a different war without these young men. Up the hill behind us here, there are grave sites of so many people who have so generously shared with me their photos, their memories, and not just me, other researchers without which we would be so clueless about what actually happened during World War II to the Japanese community, as well as this titanic and very, very successful Japanese nursery industry that once existed here. The photos that they have given to the Historical Society have made us a place where there's a definitive story of the history of the Japanese nursery community. When all the Japanese were sent to camp, the U.S. government was very well organized, even though they claimed not to be. There was a dentist in every camp. There was often a doctor in the camp. All the people from a certain area all went to the same camp. Everyone from around here went to the Topaz camp, which was in central Utah near the current day city of Delta, Utah. It's interesting that while they were kicked out, thrown out of here, they could go east to work. Many of them went to work in Chicago, they went to work in Salt Lake City, they worked in Kansas City, they worked in St. Louis. They went to New York. Some of the young women went to college back east. They were allowed to do that. They just weren't allowed to be out west. All I can say is I'm so thankful for the people who have shared so much with me and the West County community. We're here at the grave of Katie and Louis Hagen. Katie was born 1864, right over the hill in Wildcat Canyon, 1864. Louis was born no more than 100 yards from this spot in 1859. So they go way back in El Cerrito history. They had a son, also named Louis. Louis was the first person from El Cerrito who died in World War I. And in his honor, the American Legion Post in El Cerrito was named for him, and it was also the American Legion Post that was largely responsible for getting the Veterans Memorial Building that currently stands on Stockton. The Golden Gate Mausoleum, until very recently, the Sunset Mausoleum, is an entirely separate operation from Sunsetview Cemetery. They originally purchased 1 acre from the cemetery in 1928 and subsequently bought more acreage, so they now have 7 acres. Most of that acreage is on the east side of the mausoleum or on the south side of the mausoleum. The cemetery has a reservoir behind the mausoleum. That's where the water they pumped up from the other side of San Pablo Avenue would go before they used it here in the cemetery. The mausoleum had to agree not to do anything with the reservoir or the piping that leads up here. At one point there was an agreement where Sunsetview wouldn't build a columbarium if the mausoleum didn't do any cemetery burials, but the parties agreed to abandon that agreement, so now we're sort of seeing motion in both those directions by the two parties. We're standing near the top of the cemetery, and I'm right in front of the grave of Robert Kropp. We mentioned earlier that almost 70,000 people are buried here, and it's not surprising that there'd be some people who are well known outside of the El Cerrito area. Robert Kropp was well known for his work in television. For example, he starred in I Spy, and he was involved in many other television productions. There's other people in this general vicinity who we'd probably recognize the name. For example, Les Blank is buried not too far from here. Well-known documentary filmmaker who focused mostly on musicians. We're standing here at the grave of Elijah Jerry Green, better known as Pumpsy Green. He was a promising infielder, played in the minors for 6 or 7 years before he came up in 1959 to the Boston Red Sox. The Boston Red Sox were the last team in baseball to integrate, and Pumpsy was the person who joined their team and did that. Pumpsy played for 6 or 7 more years in the majors, and then he retired from baseball. But he didn't retire from the community. He was very active in the community for his entire life until he died in 2019. We're here in the Hay and Garden, a really delightful part of the cemetery. The Hay and Garden was created in the mid-1960s as part of the cemetery's marketing efforts to the Asian community throughout the East Bay. It's very successful. Lord and Lady Otani came here from Japan to view the gardens when they were first created, and it was just a very popular place to be buried. You can see why. There's unique foliage, there's unique trees, there's a pond, there's a little creek. Everything about it is very special. We also happen to be very close to the grave of Louis L. Stein, a prolific, lifelong collector of history of California and West Contra Costa County. Louis Stein founded and ran for many years the Arlington Pharmacy in Kensington. He had one of the key system streetcars that used to run up Arlington to Kensington in his backyard. He bought the Martinez Adobe to keep it from being destroyed. Even more so, he had this collection of photos and documents that was unbelievable. He was extraordinarily generous with his collection. He had a collection of West Contra Costa County photos that he both gave to the Contra Costa Historical Society, and he gave copies to all the local historical societies that existed at the time. The core collection of the oldest photos that we have in our El Cerrito Historical Society collection came from Mr. Stein. He had an amazing railroad collection that went to the Western Railroad Museum that's so important We're very fortunate for Mr. Stein, and I remember how excited I was the first time I saw that he was actually buried here in the Heian Gardens. We're standing here at the grave of Victor Castro. Victor Castro built a beautiful adobe where El Cerrito Plaza now stands. I mentioned earlier that Victor's father, Francisco, came to California with the Anza Expedition when he was a very small child. What was the Anza Expedition? In the 1760s, the Spanish in Mexico were feeling very uncertain about certain pressures going on. The British kept coming by. The Russians kept coming down from the north. The French kept stopping by from the east. The Spanish clearly had a claim on Mexico, and we think about Baja California as part of that claim. Well, in those days, where we're standing right now was known as Alta California, and the Spanish had no way laying any claim on this since no one lived here who came from Spain or who were subject to the Spanish reign. It was decided that they needed to get some people to the Bay Area to claim this amazing place. Keep in mind, the way the Spanish originally got to California and founded the mission in San Diego in 1769 was by ship. Traveling by ship sailing ship from Mexico to California was extremely difficult. I recall reading about one ship that left San Blas in Mexico and headed for California. The currents and the wind, which were the prevailing currents and prevailing wind, immediately carried them 1,000 miles west off their course and 100 miles south off their course. And after 1 month, they were back as far north as San Blas. It was amazing. And that's not the kind of trip that you send settlers on, but the Spanish didn't have any other way to get them here, and they didn't even know how to get here by land. So they looked for someone who could find a route to California, and that was Juan Bautista de Anza. And in 1774, he made an amazing trip, 2,000 miles on horseback, not knowing where he was going, except he needed to get to Monterey and San Francisco. And he did that in 4 months, and went back to Mexico and reported his findings. And the government apparently decided what he'd done was good enough, because in 1775, he started on a trip to bring settlers to California. You know, there has been a certain mythology that the first people to come to the Bay Area with Anza were some kind of royalty or high in society. How did he induce people to come to California? Like, he was taking them to a place he had been once. These people had no idea what it was like. They would travel over mountains and rivers and deserts where no one knew what waited them. They didn't know how they'd be treated by the Native Americans. And what were they promised when they got here? Well, we'll give you a gun. We'll give you some farming implements. We'll give you some clothes. And we'll try and build a community here. And so the people who came with Anza were strong and hardy, but they probably weren't from the upper crust of society. But they came here, and Francisco Castro's family was one of those, and Victor was one of their sons. And in 1839, he built the Castro adobe, one of the nicest in California by the time it was completed. There's a marker at the plaza to commemorate that. And we're here at his gravesite. Wasn't always here. You know, there was actually a family cemetery at the site of the Castro adobe, and he was there for many years. But when the whole area down there was redeveloped in the late 50s, obviously the remains needed to be moved, and so actually the Orinda Historical Society arranged to move him up here. Why Orinda? I mean, all the families that came with the Anza Expedition are now like common names in California. Castro, Berryessa, Alvarado, all these names, so many of them were people who came with the Anza Expedition. So we're ending here with Victor Castro. I'm always struck by the incredible view looking out towards the bay, which is the way I'm pointed here, And it's kind of a fitting end to our tour of the cemetery. Victor Castro was 80 years old when he died, born in 1820. Castro Adobe finished in 1839. He was a very prominent man. He was on the first board of supervisors when California became a state, and he died in 1900. So thanks for watching this. The Historical Society encourages your participation in all our events. Please keep us in mind. You'll find a wealth of information on our Historical Society website if you happen to go there. Thank you so much.